We're continuing to monitor the situation there. We're going to try now to bring in Natalie Jackson. She's a civil rights attorney in Orlando who's been monitoring the situation along with us. Natalie, can you hear me at all?
I can hear you.
Okay, so what do you make of this? This is a big verdict. It wasn't the top charge that a lot of people, including obviously prosecutors, wanted to hear, but second-degree murder against a police officer, along with a string of 16 aggravated battery convictions, that's still a substantial conviction.
Yeah, that's a serious conviction. It's a conviction that Chicago has not seen before. So I think what we're seeing with this conviction and the conviction of Roy Oliver in Texas, that the tides are kind of turning for police officers who are caught in bad conduct, and prosecutors are not allowing them to hide behind the blue wall of silence anymore.
You know, what do you make of this really strong statement that we got a couple of minutes ago from the police union? It's laced with profanity, basically saying, look, 12 ordinary citizens were duped into saving the behinds of self-serving politicians at the expense of a dedicated public servant. And it goes on from there, saying police officers are not going to be willing to walk out onto the streets and fight crime if they believe that their actions are going to result in a lengthy prison sentence. What's your reaction to that statement from the police union?
I think that's really sad that he would go after jurors in a case. Here, we see all the time in reverse when things don't go the way that the victims' families might want them to go. And people, especially the police force, they say, well, we have to respect the law. Here, I would tell these police officers to respect the law of order in the same manner.
And look, there were a number of police officers on that scene. They did not pull the trigger. They did not use deadly force that night. They stood back as this guy pumped those 16 shots into that victim, Laquan McDonald, who was gunned down in the middle of the road there. Just reading through more of this statement from the Fraternal Order of Police there in Illinois, this statement continues, what cop would want to be proactive fighting crime after this disgusting charade? And are law-abiding citizens ready to pay the price? Is that a call for officers to stand down when they see crime?
That's a call for a continuation of the injustice that happens with these officers when you allow them to stand behind the blue wall of silence. Here's the thing. Officers deserve to be protected on the streets, and they deserve to be able to protect their lives. But citizens also deserve to be protected. Officers, their job is much different from any other job. They have the right and they have the commission to be able to take someone's life and liberty. Now, we have to hold them accountable and make sure that they do it in an appropriate manner that is not unfair or unequal or unlawful.
So as a civil rights attorney, you are certainly well versed in this. What do you think ought to happen next outside of this specific situation with this specific officer?
Really, with the officer being able to walk away without being put in handcuffs is pretty much the treatment that we're going to see him continue to get. And there's a desperate disparity in the treatment here. I hope that he is treated just equally and fairly as any person who's been convicted.
So, Natalie, I hope you can stick around with us. The sound is getting a little bit, it's fading in and out there a little bit. But look, we're going to take a quick break here on the Law and Crime Network. But stick around. We are still waiting for this lengthy process of sort of wrapping things up in court and whatnot. There's nothing live to watch right now, but all of the attorneys and family members who promised to come and speak afterwards have not stepped forward yet. We have been told that they will be doing so any moment. Also, another piece of information to report here. Before the verdict was read, there were widespread reports of people leaving the city, transit stations packed in Chicago, people wanting to get out of town in case things erupted based on this verdict, which was read a little bit less than an hour ago in that Chicago courtroom. Former police officer Jason Van Dyke guilty of second-degree murder and a litany of 16 aggravated battery charges with a deadly weapon. We are going to be taking a break here on the Law and Crime Network. Stick around. We'll bring you back to court as soon as we're able. Protests are still spilling out onto the streets of Chicago at this hour after a guilty verdict against a former police officer, Jason Van Dyke, who was convicted not terribly long ago of second-degree murder and 16 aggravated battery with a firearm charges related to the death of Laquan McDonald, the teenager who was walking down the street holding about a 3-inch knife. Officer Van Dyke thought that the teenager posed a deadly threat and pulled the trigger. None of the other officers on the scene did. We watched the whole trial here on the Law and Crime Network, and it resulted about an hour ago in a guilty verdict on second-degree murder, along with those 16 aggravated battery charges. Protesters out on the streets are saying, quote, all lives don't matter until Black lives matter. Natalie Jackson is a civil rights attorney who's joining us from Orlando right now. Natalie, we're talking about these protests spilling out onto the streets, but this was a pretty serious guilty verdict. People are still not happy, though. And they're not happy because they don't think the officials handled this thing properly from the beginning. So perhaps a small sense of justice in the minds of at least some of those protesters, but not enough justice. What's your interpretation?
Right. I think that you have to understand the purpose of activists. Activists, their purpose is not for one case. This is not about Officer Van Dyke. It's not about Laquan McDonald only. This is about the injustice that goes on throughout this community, throughout this country when it comes to the lives of Black people and the way the police handle Black people. So I think that's what you're seeing in the protest. I think many times people think it's specifically about one thing, but the Black Lives Matter movement is about the
Natalie, I think we lost you there. We're going to have to switch over and listen to some other testimony from this case. We're hearing that some of the attorneys are beginning to speak in court. We're going to bring you what they're telling the public as soon as we're able to bring it in. Meantime, let's listen back to some of the key testimony in this case. We were talking earlier about the testimony of Lawrence Miller. He's a psychologist who was on the stand. Let's go back to that while we wait to hear what's being said. That's some of the previous testimony from a psychologist in the Jason Van Dyke murder case. And if you're just joining us, about an hour ago, that former Chicago police officer was convicted by a jury of second-degree murder and 16 counts of aggravated battery with a firearm. It's those aggravated battery counts that may result in the longest sentence, because if I'm reading the very complicated sentencing statute correctly, because they involve a Class 1 or a Class X felony, as I read it, there is a chance that the judge could be required to sentence this particular defendant consecutively. In other words, he'd have to serve a minimum of 6 years on the first count and then 6 on the second. This was 16 total counts of aggravated battery related to the number of bullets Officer Van Dyke fired at Laquan McDonald. Protests are happening outside the courthouse in Chicago right now, and some of the people related to the case are speaking. The defense attorney said a couple of minutes ago that police officers will become security guards now because of this verdict, and that language is echoing what we heard in the statement that I read not too long ago from the Fraternal Order of Police that referred to this verdict as one that was delivered by 12 ordinary citizens who were duped by prosecutors into a conviction. That statement from the police union saying, what cop would still want to be proactive fighting crime after this disgusting charade? And are law-abiding citizens ready to pay the price? Those are the words of the police union. We just heard from the defense attorney, police officers will become security guards. Those are direct quotes in reaction to this particular verdict coming in. We're going to listen to a little bit more from the trial as we covered it in its entirety here on the Law and Crime Network. We'll continue to break down what's happening outside that courthouse.